Wind moaned through the cracks of the shutter, carrying the low hum of coyotes in the distance. The lamps burned low, their light trembling across the wooden walls like dying embers of a life too proud to admit it was lonely. Elias' heart sat slumped in his old leather chair near the fire, eyes closed, chest rising with the slow rhythm of a man pretending to sleep. But his hand rested loosely around the armrest, just inches from the drawer where his safe key gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Across the room, faint footsteps moved with care, too careful. He heard the boards creak near the stove, then the soft rustle of fabric. The widow was awake. He could sense her even before she appeared, that poor widow from down the valley, Clara Vale, quiet as snow, living here only 3 days and already too kind for comfort. The kind of woman who stirred whispers in a place where mercy was always mistaken for deceit. A log cracked in the fire. Elias's eyelids didn't move. He breathed slow. The footsteps paused near the hallway. A faint sigh. Then the sound of her gown brushing the floorboards. Closer now. He fought the urge to open his eyes, to call her name, to demand what she was doing in his parlor at this hour. Instead, he waited. That's what this was. A test. Let's see what kind of charity hide behind those soft eyes, he thought. Let's see if she's like the rest. The house whispered around them, the long sighs of wood and wind. She stopped just a few steps away. Elias could smell soap and cold air on her. Something shifted in her hands, the faintest clink of glass. Medicine, he realized, but she'd bought none today. Her voice came next, barely above a breath. Easy, now, easy. She wasn't speaking to him. Elias listened harder, every muscle tense, a hawk waiting for sin to show its face. She knelt. He could hear her skirt touch the floor, could hear the fragile sound of glass being set beside his boot. Then, silence. For a long moment, only the fire spoke, cracking softly, flaring against the logs. Then she moved again. Something folded, paper perhaps, and lay gently on the table beside his hand. "Mr. Hart," she whispered, her voice trembling in the hush. I found your mare sick this morning. The fever was bad. I used my money for the medicine. It wasn't right to wait." The room held its breath. Elias's fingers twitched but didn't move. "I didn't mean to do wrong by tending to what's yours," she said. "But I couldn't stand by." That creature's eyes looked at me like she was asking not to be left alone. Her words cracked halfway through. Too tired, too honest to be rehearsed. Elias's jaw tightened. Then her voice dropped lower still, almost like prayer. "I don't know what ghosts walk your nights, sir, but I hope the good Lord gives you rest, the same way I prayed for my husband before he died." And then, the softest sound, her palm brushing the back of his weathered hand. Not to steal, just a touch, as though testing if the heart beneath that skin was still warm. He froze. The kind of stillness a man only feels once in a lifetime, when everything is built, everything is believed, begins to crack under the weight of a single act of kindness. Her hand withdrew. Elias dared open one eye, a sliver, just enough to see her by the fading fire. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, her face pale but resolute, eyes glistening with something that didn't belong to greed. She rose slowly, tucking her hands to her chest. The small bottle of medicine lay on the floor beside him, the label faintly visible, quinine, and beside his armchair a folded slip of paper. She turned to leave. The floor creaked once, twice. Then she paused at the doorway, glancing back toward him. The faintest smile, meant for no one, crossed her lips, like she'd spoken to his soul and didn't expect an answer. When she disappeared down the hall, Elias opened his eyes fully. The fire popped again, spitting sparks onto the stone hearth. He leaned forward, rough hands trembling, and reached for the paper. The writing was careful but plain. For the medicine, $5.20. Paid in full. Clara Vale. He stared at it a long time, then at the medicine bottle. The man who'd spent 30 years building fences and counting coins suddenly felt something old and rusted shift inside him, the slow turn of guilt grinding against memory. Outside, the night wind swept through the corral, rattling the trough chains. Somewhere beyond the hills, the coyotes sang again, their cries echoing across the empty plains. Elias pressed the note flat on his knee, then folded it, as if it might burn him if he looked too long. He thought of his late wife, Her voice one soft like Clara's, her eyes carrying the same stubborn light. He thought of the night she tended to him without question, her prayers whispered when pride kept him from saying thank you. And now here he was, an old fool pretending sleep, testing a woman who'd already been tested by the world far worse than he ever had. He sank back into his chair, rubbing his temple, staring at the door she'd gone through. The firelight flickered, dancing across the room, touching the silver frame of his wife's portrait on the mantel, her painted eyes glimmering like judgment in the glow. Damn fool, he muttered under his breath. The clock ticked. The flames crackled. But even as his heart stirred, the old suspicion tried to claw its way back. Maybe it's all a trick. Maybe she knew I'd be listening. He wanted to believe that. He almost needed to. Because believing otherwise meant facing something far worse, that his years of bitterness had made him blind to grace. He looked again at the folded note. Paid in full. No woman out here wrote words like that unless she meant every letter. The house settled into silence once more, as if even the walls were listening. He sat there till the fire shrank to a whisper, staring at the doorway where she stood. And though the night was cold, Elias' heart couldn't tell if the chill in his bones came from the wind outside, or from the truth slowly creeping in. The rooster crowed long before the light touched the mesas, but Elias' heart was already awake, or maybe he'd never slept. His chair groaned as he rose, joints stiff, eyes hollow from staring too long at the ashes in the hearth. The widow's note still lay folded in his vest pocket, its edges damp with sweat. Through the cracked door, he could hear her humming, faint, steady, like a church bell trying to reach heaven through the dust. The sound stirred something unfamiliar inside him, something that both burned and soothed. He stepped into the hall. The boards creaked beneath his boots. Her voice stopped. Then he saw her, bent over his mare in the stable yard, hands working gently, sunlight striking her hair like copper fire. The horse, usually wild-eyed around strangers, stood calm under her touch. Elias lingered in the doorway, saying nothing. He just watched. She looked smaller in the daylight than she had in the fire's glow, thinner, maybe hungrier. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and her hands were raw from scrubbing the trough. A bucket of clean water waited beside her, reflecting the pale morning sky. When she noticed him, she startled, then quickly lowered her gaze. "Morning, Mr. Hart." He grunted. "You were up early." "Yes, sir." She still had fever through the night. "I thought it best to keep her walking a bit. The medicine's helping." He stepped closer, pretending to inspect the horse. "You didn't have to do that. I pay men for that kind of work." Clara didn't answer. She just kept brushing the mare's flank, soft and even, until the animal leaned into her palm. The silence stretched until it hurt. Finally, Elias muttered, "You paid for the medicine." "I did," she said, eyes on the horse. "You didn't think I'd have done it." Her hands stopped. She toned, meeting his gaze for the first time. "I didn't think you'd let her die, Mr. Hart. I just couldn't wait to find out." The words landed quiet but heavy, like dust settling after a storm. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the tired lines beneath her eyes, the way grief lived in her posture. But there was something else there, too. Strength, the kind that doesn't show until the world's already taken everything it can. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The mare snorted, breaking the moment. Clara turned back to her work. Elias hesitated, then walked away, boots crunching over the frost-hardened dirt. Inside the house, the air felt too small for his thoughts. He stood before the mantel again, the widow's note burning a hole in his vest pocket. With a curse under his breath, he pulled it free and laid it beside the fire, but couldn't bring himself to let the flames touch it. The words paid in full stared back like a sermon. He turned, eyes roaming across the room, the neat dishes on the table, the folded blanket on the couch where she'd slept, the faint smell of soap that wasn't his own. And for the first time in years, Elias' heart wondered if maybe he'd forgotten how to tell good from bad. The floor above him creaked, small footsteps. The boy, he'd barely spoken since they'd arrived, just clung to his mother's skate, watching Elias like he was a thundercloud waiting to break. Now the boy appeared at the top of the stairs, hair tangled, rubbing his eyes. "Mama says you don't eat breakfast much," the child said shyly. Elias looked up at him. "Who told her that?" The boy shrugged. "She listens." He almost smiled. Almost. You're your mother's echo, ain't you? The boy tilted his head, not understanding. Then Clara's voice called from outside, and he scampered back down the stairs toward her. When the house grew quiet again, Elias walked toward his study. The air there smelled of old tobacco and memory. He unlocked the drawer in his desk, the same one he'd left ajar last night to bait her, and pulled out the small iron box from inside. The gold coins gleamed in the dim light, stacked like trophies of a life spent winning the wrong battles. He stared at them a long time. Then, as if moved by some old ghost, he began to shuffle through the papers tucked beneath them. Receipts, deeds, ledgers. And then he found them. Letters. At first, he thought they were his. Then he saw the handwriting, fine, curved, feminine. The ink was smudged, faded at the edges. His brows drew tight. These weren't his papers. They were hers. Letters addressed but never sent, each beginning with the same words, "My dearest Samuel." He shouldn't have read them, but he did. They said it was a mining accident, but I know better. They cut corners, and the tunnel fell in. You told me once that men with gold forget the weight of dirt above them. You were right. Elias's throat went dry. He turned another page. I've forgiven them in prayer, though my heart still burns when I hear their names. I hope heaven is kinder than this world. A tremor passed through his hand. He turned to the last letter, unfinished, the ink blotted where tears must have fallen. If ever I stand before one of them, I'll not raise my hand in hate. But I'll tell him his gold can't bury the dead, not forever. The paper slipped from his grasp. He knew those mines, knew the accident, knew the names of the men who'd cut the supports to save money. His company, his men. Elias sank back into his chair, heart thundering. Outside, he could hear her laughter, light, fleeting, as she played with her son near the trough. He buried his face in his hands. The wind rattled the window panes, dust whispering across the sill like old sins refusing to stay buried. When he lifted his head, something hard and heavy had settled in his chest. Not anger, not sorrow, something older. Guilt. He rose, pacing the floor like a cage man. For the first time in years, Elias' heart didn't know what to do with himself. He thought of calling her in, confessing everything, the mines, the deaths, his share of the blame. But what would that serve? She'd only see the devil behind the rancher's smile. No, not yet. The world outside was too still, too fragile. Then, faint but clear, the sound of hooves echoed from down the valley, fast, many of them, carrying dust and danger. Elias turned toward the window. Riders. They were coming hard, the glint of sunlight flashing off metal. He counted 5, maybe 6. His gut clenched. He knew that kind of ride. No good ever rode that fast toward Silver Creek. He stepped outside, the cold biting his skin. Clara had frozen mid-laugh, her eyes already fixed on the ridge. Her voice dropped. Those men, they are not from town. No, Elias said, his tone like dry gravel. They are not. The man lay behind her, uneasy. The wind shifted. Dust began to rise. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, they both knew the peace of this house had just ended. They say the widow's kindness was the first thing that shook Elias' heart's heart, but what came down that valley the next morning would test what kind of man he truly was. The first gunshot cracked across the valley like lightning tearing the sky. Elias' heart ducked behind the corral fence, the sting of splinters biting his cheek. The sound rolled through the ranch yard, scattering chickens and echoing off the red ridges. He shouted toward the barn, "Clara, get the boy inside." But she didn't move. She was standing in the open, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the riders cresting the hill. Dust churned behind their horses. 6 men, all with bandanas, rifles flashing in the rising sun. Clara's voice cut through the wind. "They'll come through the lower gate first. It's weaker." Elias blinked at her. "How would you?" "Because that's what I'd do." Her tone froze him where he stood. She didn't sound afraid. She sounded like someone who'd been here before. The riders drew nearer. Clara turned sharply toward the barn. "Get the horses out. Don't let them box us in." Elias hesitated only a second before obeying. Something about her steadiness, the way she moved, The way she barked orders like a commander left no room for argument. Inside the barn, the horses snorted and kicked as he flung the gates open. "Go!" he yelled, slapping their flanks. They bolted into the pasture, hooves thundering like a storm. When he stepped back outside, Clara was already dragging barrels across the yard, stacking them in a line by the trough. She had the boy beside her, helping roll what his small arms could manage. "Oil?" Elias asked. "Water," she said, shoving one into place. "The oil for later." The way she said it made him look at her twice. The outlaws split into two groups, four circling toward the lower fence, two heading for the front gate. The leader's voice carried on the wind, cruel and sharp. "Hot! We know you got gold hidden there. Best come out now, or we take the place and burn it down with you in it." Elias's stomach turned cold. He recognized that voice. Reese Calver, a name buried deep in his past, a hired man turned thief. Before he could answer, Clara snapped, "Get down!" A bullet struck the fence post beside him, sending chips of wood flying. She fired back, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, but her aim was clean. One of the riders jerked sideways and fell. Elias gaped. "Where in God's name did you learn to shoot like that?" Clara reloaded without looking at him. "From worse men than him." The boy cried out from behind the barrel stack. "Mama!" She turned, her voice steady but low. "Stay down. Baby, do as I say." The riders regrouped, shouting to one another. Clara's eyes darted toward the hill behind the barn. "There's a trail up there, too narrow for horses but just wide enough for a man. If they get around us, they'll hit the house from behind." Elias frowned. "You know this land that well." She didn't answer. Instead, she tore a rag from her skate, dipped it in the water barrel, and stuffed it into one of the oil jars. "If they do come through, light these." Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from memory. He saw it then, that flicker of pain behind her eyes. "You've done this before," he said quietly. She froze. The battle paused just long enough for the truth to surface. "Yes," she whispered. "I have." She looked toward the ridge, the wind tugging at her hair. "After Samuel died in that mine, I didn't have a penny. I fell in with a crew that rode from Silver Bend to the border. Calver was one of them. He taught me to shoot, to steal, to survive. I ran when I found out what they'd done, what we'd done. I've been running since." Her voice broke then, just once. "I never wanted my boy to know that life." Elias said nothing. The words hit him harder than any bullet could. She met his eyes. "So when I say they'll come through the lower gate, you best believe me." He nodded slowly. "I do." The riders began circling again, their horses restless, spooked by the smell of oil and smoke. Clara crouched low, motioning him closer. "We'll draw them to the corral. When they rush the gate, light the trough." "You'll set the ranch on fire," he growled. She looked at him, a faint smile ghosting across her face. "You said once everything here was built on ashes. Maybe it's time to start again." He couldn't argue. The first outlaw charged the gate, firing wildly. Clara waited. 1, 2, 3 breaths, then fired. The man fell. Another leapt from his horse, running low toward the fence. She grabbed the burning rag from the lamp, tossed it into the oil-soaked trough. Flames leapt up, roaring, forcing the rest to pull back. Smoke poured into the morning sky, thick and dark. Through it all, Elias caught glimpses of her, hair wild, face streaked with soot, eyes blazing with the same fury that had once built empires out here. For a moment, he saw not a poor widow, but something mythic, a woman forged by the desert, burning through the past that tried to claim her. He fought beside her, loading rifles, shouting to the hands who'd come running from bunkhouse. Together they held the line until the riders broke formation, retreating up the ridge under the weight of smoke and lead. When the last echo of gunfire faded, Clara dropped to her knees, chest heaving. The boy ran from behind the barrels, clutching her tightly. She wrapped an arm around him, trembling. Elias lowered his gun, staring at her. "You could have killed them all." "I could have," she said quietly, "but that ain't justice." The wind shifted, blowing smoke toward the north. The smell of fire and oil clung to everything. Elias stepped closer, his voice rough. "You saved this place." She shook her head. "No, I saved what's left of it. But they'll be back. Men like Calvert don't run far, not when they think they've got something left to take." He looked toward the horizon, where the riders were fading into the distance, 6 shadows swallowed by the desert glare. Then back at her. "You know him," he said. Her jaw tightened. "He's the one who let the tunnel collapse. My husband went in after his brother. Neither came out." Elias felt the words like a blade sliding under his ribs. "Calvert worked for me," he whispered. Her eyes snapped to him. For a moment, the world went silent. No wind, no fire, just a heavy stillness between them. Elias didn't look away. "It was my mine, my men, my greed. You've every right to hate me." She stared at him for a long moment, the weight of years pressing down on both of them. Then she said softly, "Hate's easy. I've done enough of that." The boy tugged at her sleeve, eyes wide. "Mama, will they come back tonight?" She brushed his hair aside and whispered, "If they do, we'll be ready." Elias turned toward the setting sun, a blood-red disk sinking behind the ridges. The smoke from the burned trough drifted upward, twisting like ghosts in the wind. And though neither spoke again, both knew what tomorrow would bring. The front door slammed open so hard it cracked the frame. Wind howled in after it, dragging dust and the scent of storm into the ranch house. Step away from him, Clara. A voice barked, rough, guttural, full of liquor and hate. The widow didn't move. She stood over Elijah Dane's still form on the bed, one hand clutching the rifle he'd left by the window, the other trembling, but steady at the trigger. Behind the doorway, 4 riders in dust-caked coats filled the entry like a wall of sin. Their leader, Amos Cree, sneered through the dim. His eyes gleamed with greed and memory. "You remember me, don't you?" he rasped. "I remember you. Widow Rosewood, or should I say, the one who shot my brother." Lightning cracked behind him, white and blinding. For a heartbeat, the whole room turned to glass, every detail sharp. The rain streaking through the open door, Elijah's boots at the bedside, Clara's face drawn tight in pale defiance. Then came the sound of a revolver's hammer. Clara's voice cut through it, low, certain. "He wasn't your brother. He was a killer in my home. And if you take one more step, I'll send you to join him." Amos laughed. "You think that rancher there's gonna save you? He's as dead asleep as your conscience." The others grinned, their hands hovering near their guns. Outside, thunder rolled low, like the growl of something ancient. Elijah's eyes opened. He didn't move, not yet. The widow hadn't seen it, but Amos did. He froze mid-step. For a breath, both men held each other's gaze, the rancher half hidden by shadow, the outlaw haloed in lightning. Then Elijah's hand slid beneath the blanket, slow as smoke. "I wouldn't," Amos hissed. But it was already too late. The room exploded with sound. Elijah rolled from the bed and fired once, clean, cold, and perfect. Amos stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, cursing as his pistol went wide. Clara's rifle barked next, blowing out the window and scattering the rest of the gang into the mud outside. The gunfight began in earnest. Rain poured sideways through the shattered glass. Bullets chewed through timber, kicked dust from the floorboards. The widow moved like a woman who'd known battle before, fast, fierce, unyielding. Elijah fired beside her, reloading with practiced rhythm, every motion soaked in quiet fury. Then, a scream. One of the riders fell, clutching his chest. Another tried to flank through the barn, but the widow was quicker. She swung the rifle to the side window and shot him clean off his horse. Amos was crawling for the door, bleeding, snarling through his teeth. "You don't know what she is, Dane," he spat. "You don't know what kind of killer you're protecting." Elijah's jaw clenched. "I know exactly who she is." He pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the wall beside Amos's head, sending splinters across his face. "Now ride," Elijah growled, "and don't ever come back." The outlaw stumbled out into the rain, clutching his arm. The others followed, broken and bleeding. Within minutes, the only sound left was a storm easing into silence. Elijah stood there for a long while, breathing heavy, smoke curling from his revolver. The widow lowered the rifle, her eyes glinting wet beneath the lamplight. "You should have let me handle them," she said quietly. He turned to her, brow furrowed. "You already did." For a moment, the two just looked at each other, two lives carved by loss and secrets, standing in the ruins of a night that could have ended them both. Then Elijah spoke again, voice low. "When I pretended to sleep that night, I wanted to see who you were. Thought I'd find a liar, maybe a thief." He swallowed, glancing at her worn hands, the way they shook. "But you were prying. Not for yourself, for me, for this place, for peace." Clara looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I prayed for forgiveness, for all the men I couldn't save." Elijah stepped closer. "You saved me tonight." Outside, dawn was beginning to climb over the wet plains. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and spent gunpowder. The light caught on the widow's face, soft, weary, strong. "Those men," Elijah said after a long pause, "they'll tell others. Your name will travel again." "I know," she murmured. "It always does." He holstered his revolver. "Then let it. Folks ought to know what justice looks like." She smiled faintly, just once. Then she set the rifle against the wall, the weight of her past sliding off her shoulders like dust after rain. Her voice, old, cracked by years and firelight, seems to whisper through time, as though the tale were being told again across generations. They say that night on the Dane ranch, justice rode on the wings of thunder. A rancher who'd tested a widow's heart learned his own was still beating. And the woman once called a killer became something else entirely, something the West itself would remember, not for what she'd done, but for what she refused to let die. The wind carried the last of the storm eastward, and by sunrise only the creak of the porch swing remained, soft, steady, like a heartbeat that refused to quit.